honored to welcome Professor Peter Skott, author of Structuralist and Behavioral Macroeconomics, a key work in the field of heterodox economics. He is currently a professor at Aalborg University Business School and an emeritus professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
Thank you.
To begin our conversation, we'd like to dive right into one of the central ideas of your research. So first, in the studies of inequality, you often say that it has more to do with power relations than with productivity. In practice, what does that mean for us to better understand how the labor market works today?
Okay, that's a very big question, and I would not argue that productivity and more traditional forces are irrelevant. But I think that economists have often failed to recognize that there are important power elements involved, and that, for instance, technological progress can be power biased. Let me give you a very simple example, but one could give many others and also talk more broadly. But the very simple example is if you think about a truck driver. In the past, if you were a truck driver in the US, you were based in Boston, and you were asked to drive a big load of cargo to Las Vegas. Then you start out from Boston and you wave goodbye to your employer, and you arrive in Las Vegas 5 days later or 6 days later. I'm not quite sure how long it would take for a truck, but it'll be multiple days. And along the way, your employer will really have no idea what's happening. And if you're delayed by a day, you could say, hey, there was very bad weather, or there was a big traffic jam when I was going through Pennsylvania. So you are in a situation where the employer cannot monitor the worker. And therefore, in this situation, the employer may want to pay the worker well enough so that the worker actually feels that this is fair, and yes, he's being good to me, I will also be good to him. And also so that if I am discovered, another truck driver discovers that I'm just visiting my girlfriend along the way, right? I'll get fired. And if I get fired, I will lose a lot because it's a good job and I won't find another one. But today, the trucks have little black boxes, and the employer can sit in Boston and follow exactly where each of the 100 trucks is. They can know exactly how fast you're moving. They know what the weather is like. They know whether there's heavy traffic. They know what music you're listening to. They know whether you are in the right gear or whether you are mishandling the truck. You cannot come back and say, oh, look, something bad happened. I'm sorry, I was 3 days late. Now, this is an example of a technological change. It does not make it any easier to drive the truck. Yes. But it changes the power balance. And if you look at it, truck drivers' wages have dropped enormously. You can, many other simple examples, from call centers to supermarkets to Amazon workers that are being monitored constantly as they move around the warehouse. That's a shift in power relations, and that has enabled employers to squeeze wages. And so you see this as one element in what's been going on in the US, where income inequality has increased quite dramatically.
Yes, that's perfect. It makes sense. Even here in Brazil, we see that a lot. Thank you for your answer. And second, considering that inequality largely results from power imbalances between workers and firms, what kinds of policies do you believe could generally help reduce this problem?
Well, you can think of policies at very different levels. Having strong unions will help. That'll make it harder for employers to arbitrarily fire people. It'll give a voice in relations. It will also typically, in particular if they're fairly centralized, contribute to a more equal wage distribution. Right now, the wage distribution has also widened, although lately it has come back together a little bit. But if you look at the long term from 1970s till today, wage inequality has also increased tremendously in the US. So unions would be one thing. In the US, the minimum wage is important, and there are steps now to increase it, not at the federal level as yet. The federal minimum wage is unchanged for many years now. It's at $7.25. But many states have raised their minimum wages, so that helps the low-income workers. But perhaps if you're talking sort of labor movement strategy, then I think sort of focusing not just on the wage struggle, not just on increasing wages, would be perhaps more important. The problem with increasing wages is that you may get an increase in your dollar wage, but you don't control prices. And so, in fact, what we see as an example in over the last 5 years, when I think I mentioned wage inequality has fallen in the US, but at the same time, we've seen income inequality worsen, and we've seen the profit share go up, and the real wage has been fairly stagnant. So it's certainly during the last 3-4 years. So what you may want to do if you're a labor movement would be to focus more on what you could call decommodification. Fight for a tax-funded healthcare system that's free for everybody, rather than have what the US has at the moment, which is horrible. Fight for good public schools. Somebody actually told me that private schools are much better than public schools at the below university level, at the primary school, secondary school level. I think that's bad. Yes. You want to make sure, in particular early education, that the public schools are very good. You want to fight for early education. You want to fight for a lot of these things that are important and are not paid directly as a wage. You want to have unemployment benefits. You want to have maybe pension systems. You want to have so a whole slew of reforms that are not directly related to the wage. I think for the labor movement is very important, and to push them through, you need a labor movement, and certainly in the Scandinavian countries that have, in some ways, maybe achieved more than most in this direction, the strong labor movements have been at the core of these fights, and not just in terms of having been able to go on general strike, but also in terms of just creating, influencing public opinion, reaching out to union members, teaching them, informing them, putting pressure on everybody in the movement to actually fight for these things, making people vote, informing them about who might be doing what for workers and against workers. So in that sense, I think it's a mistake if unions become very narrow and the labor movement says, oh, we're just going to fight for increases in money wages, because that may just lead to inflation.
Yes. That makes total sense. I'm kind of biased because I'm a student, but the educational topic, it's really important. So thank you so much for your answer in general, but that specific part really touched me.
But I think early education
yes.
is particularly important.
Yes.
And I may be wrong, but somebody told me that in Brazil, in fact, the public universities are very good. And that is in some sense regressive, because if you have low income disadvantaged groups not getting the schooling that allows them to get into university, so you have affluent families making sure their kids go to good schools, and then afterwards they get free good universities. It's sort of if anything, it has to be the other way around.
Thank you. Third, technological innovations are linked to rising social inequality across much of the world. But how do these innovations specifically impact inequality in emerging economies? And if you could say, particularly in BRICS countries.
Oh, that I feel I don't know much about. I mean, technological innovations may impact inequality a little bit the same way that I talked about earlier. I don't know to what extent these technologies are being used here. But another thing that may have changed the landscape for many countries is just the innovations in terms of transportation. If you think of something simple as containers and just the ability to move goods across long distances relatively inexpensively, then that has increased trade, and that has created opportunities. But in combination with maybe WTO rules that prevented countries from pursuing much in the way of industrial policies and maybe infant industry protections, and it can also lead to a deindustrialization happening too early. And I think some of those factors may have played a part in what people tell me has been a process of deindustrialization in Brazil.
Yes.
But again, I don't know much about it. And of course, the WTO rules and all that are now being broken completely and shattered by US policies. So that might open a couple of options for also other countries to follow suit.
Thank you. How's your time? Our timing?
10 minutes.
Okay. So I think let's now shift our focus a bit toward the theoretical side of economics. So do you feel that traditional/mainstream macroeconomics is becoming more open to different ideas and more pluralistic approaches?
I wish I could give a clear affirmative answer to that, but I can't. I'm actually surprised that macroeconomics, certainly kind of macroeconomic theory, if you look at the top journals, still seems to be very narrow and very rigid. I think what has happened is that microeconomics is much more open. Game theory, behavioral economics has now become completely standard. In fact, that's what microeconomics is all about, and that leaves a lot of openings. In macroeconomic theory, I don't think that has happened, but I do believe that a lot of younger economists have sort of become disillusioned with theory, and they are increasingly moving into doing purely empirical work. And of course that's also perhaps stimulated by just having more data available, having sophisticated econometrics that has improved a lot in many areas, and also having computers that can handle big data sets. What do I think of that? I think it's dangerous. It's dangerous to believe that now we can just do empirical kind of look at the evidence and that will tell us what's going on. Because the data just does not speak directly. You need to structure, you need to have some ideas guiding what you're looking at, how you do your study, how you interpret the results, how you draw policy lessons from it. And I think there are many examples of people doing sophisticated econometrics and then some hand-waving theory when they're interpreting the results, where they fall back on typically the sort of new Keynesian macro model that I don't think is a very promising platform. So macroeconomics, unfortunately, on the theory side, I think is still stuck in something that personally I think is not very helpful.
Okay, thank you. I think it's our job as students now to know that and to try to change the scenario. But now, in our international relations program, economics is mostly taught using orthodox models that don't reflect Brazil's reality. How do you think this reliance on traditional models impacts the training and effectiveness of professionals in a country that isn't growing through those same approaches?
I think it's a great shame, it's a tragedy if macroeconomics is being taught as if the models that might fit to some extent in, say, the US or Western Europe are just being taught here as this is the right way to do economics. As I mentioned, I think yesterday in the lecture, a simple, very obvious example is about unemployment and the influence of unemployment on inflation. Where if you look at the official data, you'll find that countries like Brazil, India, Mexico, those are the examples I used, but you could look at virtually any other developing economy for which you have unemployment data. And they typically give relatively low unemployment rates. And that's nonsense. I believe that in the latest data that I looked up before the talk, India had one of the lowest unemployment rates, 3.9% or something like that. But that's a meaningless figure. Brazil's was 7.7. Because if you look at India, there are millions and millions of underemployed informal sector workers, both in rural and urban areas, who would love to get a modern sector job that pays better, and they're not counted as unemployed. But India, like Brazil, I think are not in a situation of something approaching full employment the way that say the UK maybe, or Germany, or unemployment figures are imperfect, they have all kinds of weaknesses, it should be interpreted with care, even for France, the US, Canada, Denmark, whatever. But when it comes to a country like Brazil or India, I think it's bordering on meaningless, and trying to estimate a kind of new Keynesian Phillips curve on Brazilian data, I think is pretty silly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I think we could both go all day long talking about these topics, but thank you, Professor, for sharing your valuable time and knowledge with us today. This has been an insightful conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me come on the program.
As opiniões dos convidados não refletem de forma alguma a posição do Expresso. O podcast é feito com intuito informativo e sem cunho político.